staying here and likely being miserable. I'm not going to grow any. Growth's important, by the way. But if I'm just stagnant, well, that any problem that comes my way, I'm not getting out of. So we have to forthrightly go through the problem. And that's what he was kind of talking about. And think about that for just a second. I mean, we're going to talk more about the idea of purpose. And simply, I'm not going to give a lecture on philosophy or anything, but when I was getting my master's and stuff, they didn't really stress this idea of existentialism. So what that means is it's what value, meaning, and purpose does one have in their life? They stressed it a little bit. We studied it, but I think it's very important. What value, hope, and meaning do we have in our life? Because if the answer is none, then why do we have the idea of self-preservation? It's like, well, okay, I'm hopeless. I have no value. There's no meaning to life. Then why should I choose to self-preserve? Why should I care if I belong? Why do I fight for control? So I think those are very important questions, because if we don't recognize that, then we're completely, we don't have an idea of what we're doing, okay? And, having an idea of what we're doing is kind of important to getting through a problem, right? So, okay. There's an idea that, I don't know, we hear when we're really young, probably throughout our lives. And, so we just kind of talked about like this value and meaning and all this. And there's an idea, maybe some of your teachers have said this, or maybe you've had friends say this or whatever, but it's like, maybe some of you have heard like the self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, it's like, if you think bad, then bad things will happen. Well, I think that's really superficial, and I don't know if I agree with it completely or not. But I will say that we tend to behave in ways that resembles who we think we are. Right? We behave in ways that resemble the person that we think we are. Now, I think that is necessarily important. Right? Because think about that for a moment. If we associate ourselves with fear, then our brains actually respond to stimuli differently than if we didn't. That's important, right? If we associate ourselves with negative things, we have actually, over time, a physiological change. That's important to know, right? Another thing that's kind of associated with this is the idea of efficacy. And what efficacy is the belief that we can do something. Right? So it's like, if I don't think that I can overcome an obstacle, whether because I'm not worth it, or because I don't have the control to, or whatever, because we've got all these thousands of reasons to think so if we're in a bad situation. But if I don't think that I can do it, well, the likelihood of you choosing to do it and behaving in a manner that suggests that you can actually overcome the obstacle is very slim. Now, the idea of efficacy is also positively important, right? Because if we think that we can do something, in as much as, let's say, make a psychological leap towards something positive, that's also important, right? Now, the likelihood of us failing is high, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. Okay, so efficacy. Okay, that's where I left off. The belief, basically, that we can forthrightly move throughout the world despite it being difficult and it not killing us. Because remember, this comes back to self-preservation also. Right? We don't want to die. We fight against dying. Naturally. So we have to be brave enough to tackle the obstacle and learn something about ourselves so that we don't repeat it in the process. Okay, by the way, memory, the reason we have memories, this is interesting. We think about why memory is important. It's like, well, I need to remember the grocery list. I need to remember anniversaries. Actually, the reason that we have memory comes back to self-preservation also. Because it's like, I have to remember that the fire is hot, so not to endanger myself again, right? So that is the reason that we have memories. It's not necessarily for tests or anniversaries, although if you forget your anniversary, you're likely to be in dire danger. So we got to be brave enough to tackle the obstacles. And if we cower away, that only enforces more negative emotions, right? And I've explained that they're inherently deeper. Okay. So let me recap kind of what I've said so far. We've talked about pain. We know what pain is. We've talked about purpose to some extent, right? We've established that it has some modicum of importance to us, even though we may not see it when we're down. But purpose is essentially important. So now we'll talk about pursuit and what do we do to get there. There's a couple types of different therapies that I use regularly. Okay, so one of them, obviously, if you haven't guessed this, is what's called existentialism. But the idea is that, what is valuable in your life? Okay, is value and purpose have meaning. The other one that I use is behaviorism because, well, it's actually branches of cognitive behavioral therapy because behaviors is something that we can control, and that's important if we want to let's say, reestablish some sense of ability. Then we need to know that we have some element of control in our lives, right? So those are the two that I primarily use. I mean, there's others, obviously, but I like cognitive behavioral therapy because it's simple, right? Because here's what it is. You need goals. If someone comes to therapy and they're like, look, I want to feel better. What does that mean? Define better. Well, I'm sad. I want to not be sad. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Because I really give them a hard time about this because I want them to think about it. You can't just say you want to feel better. That's not sufficient. It's like, okay, by what time frame would you like to be able to get out of bed? Because if you're staying in bed for, let's say, 23 hours a day because you're so hopeless that you can't get out, because you haven't eaten in a week, and you're tired and you're miserable, the only time you get up is to go to the restroom. If you go to the restroom at all, let's start there, because that's something that's measurable, right? It's like to say you want to feel good doesn't mean anything. What is it that you can do in order to improve the likelihood that you will feel better? That's the important thing. And not only do we want to do that, but we want to tackle it in very small steps, right? Because you can't. I was taking music lessons in Moorhead one time, and I was playing the saxophone at high school, and so I was taking lessons at the college, and I wanted to learn how to do something. I wanted to learn how to play these certain notes on the saxophone, right? Because I thought they were cool. They used to be high notes. It sounded really awesome, and I wanted to know how to do that. So I asked the doctor, what's his face? I said, look, how do I do this? And so what he says to me is, Grant, you can't start building a building starting with the last brick. So, I chewed on that for the last, let's say, 20 years, because there was a point to that. It's like people want things to happen, but they don't want to go through the processes, the increments, in order for them things to happen. Because it takes time and a lot of effort, and consequently a lot of failure, because things are not easy, especially if it's a goal worth pursuing, right? So you got to have a goal. It's got to be obtainable. It needs to have a purpose and value to you specifically. It's got to be measurable, and it should approach something that is responsible, right? Those are the things that I kind of want to, I tell my people that in session. Because all those things are, well, they're important. Watching a video on YouTube, because I watch a lot of YouTube, and I don't know if anybody is familiar with Dr. Peterson or not, but he was talking about carrying the maximum weight that you can bear. And I give that a lot of thought, a lot of consideration. You know, exactly what extent is that important? Well, the idea is carrying the most responsibility that you can without it breaking you. Well, why is that important? Because it isn't obvious that we want anything other than convenience, right? It's like, well, it would be much better to stay in bed all day and have Cheetos all over my belly than to do something that resembles responsible. But for anyone that's laid most of the time, for anyone who is laid in bed with Cheetos on their belly over a course of, let's say, 2 or 3 days, man, they get antsy. They're driven to do something differently. Now, they may not want to go out and let's say chase world hunger, but they want to do something differently. They want to do something differently because that isn't sufficient. It doesn't need to be deeper than that, right? So it's like people have this inherent psychological drive toward something with purpose. Okay, so the idea that Peterson was trying to bring up is how much can we bear of that? Because if we can bear a large amount of that without breaking and succumbing to the very place that we don't want to be, well, we're likely to be most fulfilled and most happy, right? Because it gives us a sense of purpose. So there's a correlation, remember, that I said between responsibility and happiness. Well, that's why. The way that you bear must also be goal-oriented and towards something positive and meaningful. It's like my goal can't be to drink, let's say, another case this weekend because I drank 2 last weekend. I can't have the goal something that is necessarily harmful. Those aren't good goals. Now, they might be a goal, but they're good goals, right? They're not going to necessarily and inherently bring value. Okay, so another idea toward this is it's like selfishness isn't good, right? It's like if you can't do something good for yourself as well as someone else, maybe that task isn't optimal, let's say. But you have to be considerate enough of your own needs before you become naive. So it's a weird tightrope. One of the things that I teach kids also, I don't really see kids much for therapy anymore because it's hard to talk about them. It's hard to talk to them about meaning and purpose because their brains aren't fully formed. Like our brains don't fully form until somewhere between 20 and 24. But kids don't have this really good idea about let's say, purpose. But they can understand behavior rather easily. And I think this is pertinent to adults also. It's like, well, I taught kids like, look, stop before you do something, think about what you want to do, and then behave. It's like, don't just get straight to the behavior without thinking about what you're going to do, because then there's going to be consequences, then you're going to point fingers and blame everybody, and you're going to get more trouble, and it's going to completely defeat the whole purpose of you doing it in the first place. It never ends well. So the idea is if you want to discontinue getting in trouble, then you will think about what the consequences are, right? So that you can improve your behavior. All right, well, I think that's relevant to adults too. How often is it that we don't really give any regard to what the future may behold as a result of our behavior? I mean, that's directly related to responsibility also. It's like, okay, so I'm going to choose to go to a party, even though I have a test tomorrow. Now, good things are going to come of that, right? I'm likely to, let's say, meet a girl, want to be with my friends, I'm going to get blitzed so that I don't have to think about this test. So, without it, it's a great idea. There's no good reason for me not to go to the party. Okay, because I'm satisfying the need to belong, I'm satisfying the idea of control, and self-preservation because I'm being accepted. Right? I'm making friends. Okay, so I go to the party, I get blitzed, and I do absolutely terrible on the test the next day. And if I don't regret it, that's a bad thing. If I don't learn something from that. So the idea is that while it may be more painful now to be responsible, should I neglect my friends? Should I neglect the booze? Should I neglect all those things? And I stay home and study, which is sorrowful and painful. I don't want to do it, especially with the knowledge of knowing that I could be having fun. But then, let's say that greatly enhances the possibility of me of doing well on the test. So I'm rewarded for it. And what happens when I'm rewarded for it? Well, I'm likely to repeat that because it just so happens to be that we as humans kind of like rewards. So we tend to do that again. So that's why it's important to stop thinking that before you behave. It's responsible. Another idea that maybe I don't talk about this very often. It's like, what role does nutrition play in your life? You know, it's like we want to take decent care of our bodies, but we don't care. As long as we're kind of happy, we just kind of skip through life like a rock in a creek, right? We don't care. So, but there's a direct correlation between our psychological health and our physiological health. And if we don't at least consider the fact that we're not taking care of ourselves physiologically, then, well, what do we expect to happen? Right? And think about it. I mean, it's like, okay, so I haven't slept in 2 nights and I'm constipated. Happen to be a little depressed too. Well, you think there's not a relationship to that? What if you eat and try to get better sleep? Improve those, let's say get on a regular cycle, right, of sleep. Then your bowels are likely to work better also. So, I mean, that's important. Things like that are important. Therapists specifically psychiatrists, used to, instead of prescribing like antidepressants or something for, there's this thing called seasonal affective disorder. And what happens is that people with seasonal affective disorder have the tendency to get sad in the wintertime when things are dying, right? So, and it seems to be consistent every year. So one of the things that our body needs in order to have, let's say, proper emotional regulation is vitamin D. So what the psychiatrists used to do, and maybe they still do, I'm not sure, is tell people with seasonal affective disorder to lay in the tanning bed because they would get vitamin D that way. And that's important. I mean, things like that's important to know. One more thing I really want to touch on. I really talk a lot about people wanting, one of the things that they want to do in order to reduce the anxiety. It's like, okay, so we find value, right? We establish some idea of value that's toward a goal. And the idea is that toward that goal as responsibly as possible. Okay. Now here's another thing, and I alluded to this earlier, because we think that we work under the assumption that we're masters of our cognitive and emotional and behavioral domain. So here's the thing. I'm like, okay, so here's maybe a good behavior, right? What do you think about this idea? And sometimes they'll be receptive or not receptive. Most often I try to get them to come up with the idea to begin with, but you'd be amazed how some people, it's not easy to come up with a goal, a personal goal, especially with any amount of specificity. So, okay, so we identify something that's a value, and how to incrementally do it. Okay. I'm like, well, okay, well, here's what we got to do. We have to practice it. And the idea of practicing behavior is kind of weird, because it's like, well, look, I've been talking a long time. I've been walking a long time. I've been behaving in a certain way for a long time. And I'm old enough, I don't need practice anymore. And they kind of reject the idea of any kind of practice. It's like, no. If you have, let's say, if you have problems interacting with people, shake someone's hand today. So you got, or hold a door for them. You don't even have to touch them. Just say hello to someone. You will be met with resistance, like psychologically. Something inside your brain will be like, don't do it, because it's scary, because it's novel, it's new. Okay, so they'll come back to me and be like, look, man, it's rough stuff. I tried. Okay, well, look, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to try it. Okay, and maybe that will get them to talk to me. Okay, practice with me. And of course, they think that's a silly idea, but it's not, and here's why. It's like they practice moving their muscles, like their mouth muscles. That's not a trivial thing. So maybe they have to practice that a month with me. And then they're like, okay, man, look, I'm going to try to go out in the lobby as I'm leaving and say bye to someone, or hello, or even maybe just nod my head. All right, man, do it. And then they'll do it, and they're rewarded by it. So the likelihood of them repeating that behavior, you would think it's natural, but it's not. Because guess what? It turns out that people naturally have fears. And so let's say it works out a time or two, but then let's say the next day or maybe on that afternoon, they're like, and they shy away from people again. Okay, so they come back to the next week. They're like, man, I failed. I'm treated. It's okay. The likelihood of you failing is actually pretty high. And then I explain how people just don't like change and how change is hard. And that expect that you can just do something without resistance is basically, well, it's not going to happen. I mean, if there was not going to be no resistance, then they wouldn't be there in the first place. They would already be doing it. So, okay, so I'm like, look, man, you're going to fail, but that's okay. Let's try it again. And maybe it takes another 3 weeks or 4. And finally they come back and like, look, man, all last week, I said hi to probably like 10 people. Awesome. Good stuff, man. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to practice that until it's perfected. We're not going to move to step 2 just yet. Okay? Let's say there's 10 steps between here and where you want to be. We're not going to we're not going to go to step 2. We're going to stick with step 1. Practice it and master it. And so the idea behind that is, and I explained this to them, it's like, okay, there's an idea, it's called neuroplasticity. And the idea behind neuroplasticity is that our brains are malleable. They can change and adapt to things, right? Sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not, because they can adapt to trauma early on. That's why children that are traumatized very young, because, well, brains lose their maladaptivity over time, right? Okay, but so a child's brain is very malleable. Anyway, so the idea is that our brains can change, and I really stress this because it's important. Because one thing, it gives them hope. It gives them something to identify with. Like, well, it's like you're not going to have a sore throat forever, right? Because there's remedies. There's physiological changes that can occur in your body so that you don't have sinus issues the rest of your life, or at least not the rest of the season, right? Okay. So we talk about neuroplasticity, and I tell them it's something like Hazard right now. Like Hazard's going through a lot of construction, and it's easy to be like, man, this sucks. I'm 30 minutes late to work because of traffic and blah, blah, blah. You know, it used to be just basically a 1-lane road or maybe a 2-lane road here and there, and it was just fine, and they had to mess it up. Okay, so anyway, the idea is that, well, there's growing pains, right? So it's growing, and it's hard. It's like you got to take different roads, you got to take different passageways, you got to plan your trip differently. There's a lot of intricate details that you have to necessarily be aware of in order to meander through the town, because it's changing. Now, let's say over this 2-year span. Over the 2-year span, when everything is fully developed, what's it going to be like? Yes, man, this is awesome. I get to work 10 minutes earlier now than I did before they started. because it's changed, it's evolved, it's convenient. So here's the idea with neuroplasticity in practice. Over time, if we can be patient for 2 years, I'm not saying that change necessarily takes 2 years to occur, but I'm to keep with the idea of Rover here. If we can be patient for 2 years, things will be better. Now, during that time, we have to practice endlessly, as if it's very important to us. Behave as if it's very important to us. Okay? So we find a behavior that we can do, and we master it. And we do it to the point that it becomes automated. And at that point, there's this physiological change, neurologically. Okay? We don't have to think about it anymore. It's like a video game. Most everybody in here has probably played a video game. It's like when you first get the game, you have to figure out like the board, the world, the controls. There's things that you can't, it's difficult. It has a certain degree of difficulty. Okay, let's say by the end of the year, maybe for some people the end of the month, but at some time, it's like, man, I could play the game, eat a quarter pounder, drive with my feet. I can do all these things because it's so easy. It's become this automatic psychological process. It requires no effort. Okay, well that's a direct result of neuroplasticity. And so the idea is work toward a goal till you can master it. Then work toward the second part of that goal. Master that. You will fail, but that's okay because now you have efficacy. You believe that you can do it. Even when you come back over here, it's like, well, I failed. Well, sure you have, that's okay. What do you think about it? Well, I didn't get that far. Yeah, guess what? You can do it again. So they come back over here. Maybe they fail, maybe they don't, but at some point they're like, I think I can do this. So you have to take this very slow, systematic process and get them to where they can master, and maybe you, but figure out a way to master a particular process toward a goal. Because guess what that is? It gives you a sense of responsibility. It gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a sense of value. All those things are directly related to happiness, right? It's not about feeling good about yourself while you're doing it necessarily, because we tend to feel really actually kind of crappy most of the time. Doesn't matter. We got to do the most responsible thing, and if we want to work towards something that, let's say, approaches happiness, we're going to do the most responsible thing, and that's toward goals despite difficulty. So, well, I guess that's that. All right, so to kind of finish this up. Pain is kind of an obvious name, right? It's not avoidable, it's not optimal, and it's worse if it isn't faced head on. Because it's inevitable that it's going to be, it's inevitable that it's going to be faced, right? We can't just not have pain in our lives. And we talked about purpose, like you inherently have it irrespective of your acknowledgement of it, okay? And to what degree do you want to be purposeful? I mean, if you want to be happier, then you will find out to what degree purpose matters to you and where you can align yourself with have purpose in your life. Because that inherently affects the kind of mood and outlook that you want to have toward responsibility. And if you want to be happy, then you will approach responsibility. So, and then finally, we actually have a duty to be responsible to ourselves if we don't want to die. And self-preservation tends to be an important thing. And then finally and lastly, pursuit. What can we risk and not die? Think about that, because that's kind of deep. What can we necessarily and inherently risk without dying? Because if we want to reach a goal, it's necessary to know that. It's like, what are we willing to gamble? Are we willing to gamble not feeling good today in order to feel much better for a longer duration in the future? If so, that might be a good risk, right? Okay. So what are we willing to risk and not die? And how much are you willing to sacrifice now for the betterment of tomorrow? I kind of talked about that. The pursuit is not easy, but how much are you willing to fail? I kind of talked about that also. So, well, I guess that's kind of it. The idea up here was not to necessarily, because look, anybody can Google 5 reasons to reduce anxiety. I happen to do that, and I've happened to find out that they suck. I think Google's an absolutely terrible resource for anyone that's necessarily suffering very much, because it's like, well, okay, so I need to sit and I need to I need to meditate, I need to breathe deeper, I need to eat better, I need to, okay. Well, yes, you should be doing that anyway, okay? Do you know to practice those things? Do you know to be patient with yourself, let's say over the next 6 months? Because guess what? You're not going to do those things and magically feel better tonight. That's not going to happen. That's not the way psychology works. Humans are not designed that way to automatically feel better. And as obvious as that almost is, it's not, because people don't know it. Otherwise, they wouldn't rely on Google, right? I guess that's it. The whole purpose of me being here is just kind of to explain, to give purpose, essentially. Because I think it's important for people to think more deeply about life than just to think, well, I'm sad, what can I do about it? I need to read Google. Well, Google could be your friend, but it can be your enemy also. Probably with a higher likelihood of being your enemy. And so, I wanted to give someone, hopefully, something to think about, and think about more deeply. Something that approaches purpose and the importance of carrying a heavy load. Something that is, because it's inherently important to be responsible. And so I don't know if anyone out there is irresponsible. I'm not suggesting that. But are you as responsible as you can be? Because if you're feeling bad and you're not as responsible as you necessarily can be, then maybe you need to approach something more responsible to be more happy.